Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's spend a few minutes with Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet. This book was originally published back in 1943, and I read a translation by Bernard Frechtman that was published in 1963 by Grove Press, and this edition has an introduction by none other than Jean Paul Satre. So, Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet. This came on my reading radar at the beginning of the year. I was talking to someone about the film adaptation of Querelle by Jean Genet, which I had read years and years ago, and I thought, well, maybe I will reread Querelle. And so I went and was looking through Jean Genet's works and just decided I would give this one a read instead. So Our Lady of the Flowers. This book was so interesting. It's a written in prison book. So if you keep up with my channel, a couple of chats ago, I chatted The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, which was also written in prison, and which was also sort of pertained to this person in prison's relationship and to the divine, right? And so Our Lady of the Flowers was also written in prison when Jean Genet was actually in prison, and it pertains to a character called Devine, and her relationship actually also with the divine, but quite a different relationship here we're talking about. So Jean Genet wrote this in prison on paper, like bag paper that the prisoners were given to make paper bags out of. And true story, apparently, he wrote this and then a guard found the book and destroyed it, and he wrote it all again from memory according to the introduction of this edition by Jean Paul Satre, which I thought was fascinating. But it's a very poetic sort of novel where the author is the narrator, so sometimes we're actually taken out of the story, and the narrator's name is Jean. He's in prison, and it's really his sort of meditations and not really meditations, but his fantasies. So it's highly erotic. This has gotten it into some censorship trouble over the years, but it's highly erotic, sort of fantasies around this homosexual underworld of Paris of the time. And it all circles around a character named Devine, which I think is an aspect of Jean Genet himself as he's projecting himself in prison to the outside world. The book is dedicated to someone named Maurice Pelorge. So let me just get this dedication up. Pelorge, yeah. And the dedication here in the beginning says, "Were it not for Maurice Pelorge, whose death keeps plaguing my life, I would never have written this book. I dedicate it to his memory." So the author here, Genet, is dedicating this book to Maurice Pelorge. So I looked up Maurice Pelorge, and he was actually a convicted murderer and was guillotined in 1939. He was sort of a bit hustler, and he killed a guy over just a relatively small amount of money. This is an actual photograph of Maurice Pelorge. But so as the novel opens, the prisoner, Genet himself, has on his cell walls these photographs that he's cut out of newspapers and magazines, and they're mostly criminals and lowlifes. And so, but we go back and forth we mostly spend the time in this world of Devine and this other circle of other sort of criminals and these people existing on really the fringes of Parisian society from this time. So the main character is Devine, and her male character. So she is a male, but about pronouns. So the author mentions early on in the novel that he's using the feminine pronouns, most of the time, but he says, he has a disclaimer, whenever he's saying she, he's really meaning a male unless he specifies otherwise. So almost all the characters in the book are actually males, but they use the she, the female pronouns. So Devine her male counterpart, her actual, whenever Devine remembers her boyhood, it is as a male, as this boy, Louis Colafroy, I think is how it was pronounced. But so he's a character in it as well, sometimes in Devine's childhood. But Devine, there's Mimosa 1, Mimosa 2, and Mimosa 3. She has kind of a love-hate relationship with Mimosa 2, I believe. First Communion, Milord the Prince. So everybody has these nicknames. She takes up with this pimp named, she calls him Dainty, Darling Daintyfoot. And then eventually, into their circle, he brings into their circle another sort of, kind of hood, who is Our Lady of the Flowers. Our Lady, they call him Our Lady, who has committed a murder, who is a murderer. And so they've all been involved in crimes of various kinds. Devine is basically a prostitute, working in prostitution, and yeah, the others are different kinds of thieves, and as you know, we even have a murderer among them. So, how to approach this book? This chat. I thought I'd just run through a few things about it that I thought were super interesting, or that were really kind of pretty. So, Devine. As I mentioned, it's kind of poetic, and there's a quote here at the beginning of the book. It says, "Since Devine is dead, the poet may sing her, may tell her legend, the saga, the annals of Devine. The Devine saga should be danced, mimed, with subtle directions. Since it is impossible to make a ballet of it, I am forced to use words that are weighed down with precise ideas, but I shall try to lighten them with expressions that are trivial, empty, hollow, and invisible." But it really kind of works. It really is kind of like a ballet. There's a certain grace to the narrative here. It flows back and forth, and it does involve this sort of criminal element and these sort of people on the make and take. But nevertheless, there's a beauty to it that runs throughout the novel, I thought. There's a quote here about Devine. It says here, "Devine is humble. She is aware of luxury only through a certain mystery which it secretes and which she fears." So she comes from this background, right? She's kind of, from the country, but she goes to Paris, and this is describing how she learned how to appreciate luxury. She managed to score some money off this Argentine, and so she spent the week buying this. She bought this expensive luggage, and then she'd go board a train, and then before the train would leave, she would call porters to come and get all of her things and take her to a luxury hotel where she would hang out, and she played this sort of role and learned how to, learn this sort of how to affect a luxury. And so I thought that was pretty cool. There's another quote about nobility. So I thought this was kind of interesting too, because nobility, I think that a lot of times we think of ourselves as being, especially, nowadays, where everybody's equal. So we have this idea on one hand that everybody's equal, but there's this fascination with nobility and royalty. And, this runs through all of culture. And there's a quote here that says, "Nobility is glamorous. The most egalitarian of men, though he may not care to admit it, experiences its glamour and submits to it. There are two possible attitudes towards it, humility or arrogance, both of which are explicit recognition of its power." So even if you embrace sort of the glamour of nobility, that's sort of acknowledging its power. But if you even reject that, you're actually showing what power that sort of feeling still has. And I just think that's really interesting, because nobility, even though we live in this democratic society here in the U.S., that we have this sort of fascination with nobility, and we create nobility out of celebrities, right? So where we have no aristocracy here in the U.S., we still create one, because that seems to be something that's very human. So I thought that was super interesting. There's another quote here about Michelangelo's Moses that I thought was a real poetic sort of sentence about Devine. It says, "The sitting posture of Michelangelo's Moses is said to have been necessitated by the compact form of the block of marble he had to work with. Devine is always being presented with odd-shaped marbles that make her achieve masterpieces. So Devine is always given these weird shapes of marble, to create her sort of life. She's creating this poetic life for herself, or at least this sort of dream life that the author in prison is creating for himself. There's a discussion around fir trees and what beautiful trees they are. And the quote here says, "Firs are amazing trees, which I have often seen in Italian paintings. They are meant for Christmas mangers and are thus involved in the charm of winter nights, of the magi, of gypsy musicians and vendors of postcards, of hymns and kisses given and received at night, barefooted on the rug." That to me was a beautiful sort of expression of, fir trees. And he's seeing this fir trees around a pond, but it's reminding him of Christmas, this sort of connection to the divine. And I thought that was really kind of a cool passage. I'm kind of rushing through these, but just to keep, I thought the best way, because the novel is not linear, there's not a story per se being told, although there is, but it's not exactly linear, like there's not a plot per se. It's just sort of the reflections or sort of these snippets of the life of Devine, of Colefroy, her boy aspect from when she was younger, and then the other sort of characters that come in and out of Devine's life, as well as Jean Genet in prison. It's really just a work of poetry in a way, more so than a work of like a literary just narrative from plot arc, if that makes sense. All right, so I think that let me just go down to sort of like this last quote here that I wanted to read. It's about the saintliness of Devine. It says, "Unlike most saints, Devine had knowledge of it. There is nothing surprising in this, since saintliness was her vision of God, and higher still, her union with him. This union did not occur without difficulty, pain, on both sides, both Devine's and God's. On Devine's side, the difficulty was due to her having to give up a stable, familiar, and comfortable situation for too wondrous a glory. To retain her position, she did what she thought fitting. She made gestures. Her whole body was then seized with a frenzy to remain behind. She made gestures, some of frightful despair, other gestures of hesitation, of timid attempts to find the right way, to cling to earth and to not rise to heaven. She didn't want to die. She wanted to live. So this is Devine making these gestures, or poetic gestures in the sense of Devine, creating this sort of poetry out of life and out of her sordid life that she actually has. So, I think I'll leave the chat at that, but this is a complicated book to talk about because there's no linear story really, and but it is, when I read it, I thought, I'm not exactly sure what I read, but it sure was cool. So I did enjoy it very much. All right, so my next chat coming up, let me just get to the cover. It's going to be Children of Dune by Frank Herbert. I'm about halfway through this, so I should have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.